These are the men that were All-American. Well, maybe just All-State. Well, maybe just All-Conference. Maybe they were all bench-warming stud muffins. But they are the men of MMA Lockup.
Hey out there, MMA Lockup fans. This is Bernard Oliver on MMA Lockup. Make sure you guys go like us on Facebook at MMA Lockup. Tweet us at any time at MMA Lockup. On Twitter, you guys can go at us on Google+, look us up on YouTube. Lots of stuff up from Vegas, lots of stuff up. Chris and I having fun with the guys out in Vegas and definitely doing interviews and stuff. If you guys haven't seen that yet, make sure you go look at that from UFC 162. I know we've had a couple of events since then. We had a couple of current events that we want to talk about here. I'm going to be joined by Chris Matthews here in a second. But before Chris gets on, I'm actually going to run down a list here of things we kind of want to talk about. You know, Bellator and UFC are beefing. We got UFC on Fox Sports 1 coming up. Shogun versus Sonnen. And then we have Campman versus Condit on Wednesday, the 28th of August. And then you've got UFC 164 on August 34th. That's 3 events in a week's time later in the month. That's crazy. Melvin Gillard, Ross Pearson on UFC on Fox 8 in England. We've also got a couple other things to talk about with you guys today. But let me get Chris on the line. Chris, how you doing down there in Central Arkansas?
Loving it, man. Just trying to spread the MMA Lockup brand. In talks right now with a couple different radio stations, FM frequencies, and really just trying to get involved more in the Central Arkansas scene. If there's going to be a talent pool in the state of Arkansas, Central Arkansas is going to be an integral part of it. And if that's the case, MMA Lockup's going to be right in the middle of it.
If you guys didn't know, Chris has actually moved down to Central Arkansas, expanding the brand, expanding our fan base, doing all kind of great things down there. We got a lot of things in the works. But getting back to these topics, Chris, I was telling everybody that we were going to speak on this Bellator and UFC beef. Man, do you feel like it's legit?
Yeah, it's as legit as the Strikeforce UFC beef or the IFL or Elite XC. We know how this all ends. I guess the real question is what's Bellator's motive for doing this? Is it just to get more publicity, or is it they really feel like their talent could compare with that of the UFC? I think that's really the main question. The UFC is going to blow them off, discredit them. That's what they're good at, and, it's worked for them in the past.
Yeah, I mean, besides hanging on to a couple of those fighters at Bellator that, people obviously want to see fight in the UFC, I really don't think it's a good idea, really, to beef with the UFC, seeing as how they're the biggest MMA brand in the world. It's just kind of weird. Maybe it is a publicity stunt. I think that's a good point that you made.
Well, and you got to look at it this way as well. You look Hector Lombard, he defected from Bellator, went to the UFC, has not had the best luck, not near the luck he had in Bellator. You got right now Eddie Alvarez, one of the top fighters in Bellator, who's currently not fighting for them. So, I wonder if it's one of those ploys to take attention away from that and put it more towards the brand.
Yeah, they definitely had. I mean, you've got Eddie Alvarez, mad in court doing some other things. Now that seemed to settle down a little bit. You had the women's champion fighting on the undercard in Bellator, which really made me raise an eyebrow. So they really respect the fighters that they have on their roster. But apparently that's gone under the rug too. So maybe they are trying to, take some attention away from that.
And, also the UFC signed with Fight Metrics in reference to the UFC World Fighter Rankings, which MMA Lockup is a part of. But, as well as I do, me and you take part in those rankings, there's not any Bellator fighters in the list that we can choose from. Now, that being said, it kind of makes you wonder, do they kind of feel left out with that? You have a Ben Askren in the welterweight division who's done very well, and Michael Chandler as well for Bellator, that could legitimately have an argument to be in the top 10 in the world in their weight class. It could be some type of push to get more attention to those fighters also. I think there's a lot of elements that play into it, but ultimately, Bellator is trying to spread their brand and take away from bad publicity, such as the dispute they're having, again, with Eddie Alvarez, to where Eddie Alvarez is pretty much saying they're not as legitimate as they might make out to be.
You're listening to MMA Lockup on Fox Sports 1190. That is Chris Matthews down in Central Arkansas, your host of the show, with me up here in studio in Fayetteville. So, yeah, we're pretty spread out, doing some great things here. Let's move on from the beef, because we're going to talk about that more in the following weeks, I'm sure. UFC on Fox Sports 1 kicks off next week. Man, Fox Sports 1 is really being marketed in a huge way, with the UFC being right behind football. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, you got Brian Stan, who left the UFC. He does do some commentating, but he's going to be going more into college football for Fox Sports, which I'm very excited to see. He played college football. He was a linebacker himself. It's a good fit, and I like the way the UFC is integrating themselves with other sports. You know, if you're going to sit there and pair your stuff with a sport, what's more American than football right now? I know baseballs are a pastime, but football's kind of taking the lead out of all the sports. I think the UFC is very smart by trying to not so much pair themselves with football, but heck, if you're taking one of your fighters, putting them as a football commentator, and then also going back to football, like you just stated, I think it's a smart move.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely intelligent move, and Fox is really marketing the UFC very greatly. I mean, they're doing an awesome job of marketing the UFC. I mean, you can't see a UFC on or a Fox Sports 1 commercial without seeing knockouts and UFC highlights, and I thought that was a really great move by Fox and by the UFC really to work together to get that out there. I mean, you see football, then you see UFC. You see NASCAR, then you see UFC. You see baseball, college football, then you see UFC. I was like, wow, you guys are really throwing it out there.
Yeah, and I think it's quite important because, Fox is in competition with ESPN, who hasn't been the most kind to the UFC. There was talks with the UFC trying to pair with one of the major networks, ESPN being one of those. Those deals fell through. They signed with Fox, and right now I think the UFC is making the most of it. And Fox right now, they have the NFC for NFL. They have also BCS games for college football, and they have, conference affiliations in reference to Division I college football. I like it. You got combat sports in reference to MMA, and then you have a team combat sport, if you will, close to that being in football. Makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense, man. We got, in the next week, starting on Saturday, we're going to have 3 UFC events in a week's time. We're going to have UFC on Fox Sports 1, we were talking about, Shogun versus Sonnen on August 17th. You're going to have Campman versus Condit. That's another UFC on Fox 1 event on Wednesday. That's a new kind of day to have a big event like that. But Campman versus Condit on Wednesday the 28th. And then you got UFC 164 ending the month on August 31st. 3 events in a week's time. I don't think that you can get much more MMA than that.
Yeah, people are wanting their MMA fix. This is definitely the time that they're going to get it. Carlos Condit, some people might say his fights are boring coming out of the Greg Jackson camp. But Martin Kampmann always has a way of making fights fun. Who do you like in this particular bout before I give my prediction?
I mean, I really like Condit. I still am kind of in the camp of saying that Condit really beat Johnny Hendricks. I see Johnny Hendricks being very one-dimensional, and if he goes in the GSP fight one-dimensional, GSP is going to exploit that. I really see Condit and Kampmann being a war. After seeing his chin hold up to Johnny Hendricks in that fight, catch left hand after left hand, and still stay in there and what I thought win the fight, I think Condit is definitely going to be my pick for this one. Kampmann is definitely not to be underrated. He's got KO power. He's got submissions. He's got everything. Condit also being very well-rounded. I know we use that a lot, but, man, I really feel like Condit is going to come away with the win.
Yeah, Carlos Condit, very, very skilled in all areas of his game. Just vintage Greg Jackson fighter, really, when you look at it. Martin Kampmann, on the other hand, looks very, very good his last few fights. Then went up against Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks dismantled him. The thing about Martin Kampmann is the fights that he fights, nothing happens like you expected. So that being said, it kind of makes you wonder, how's this fight going to go with Carlos Condit? Because, on paper, you got to take Carlos Condit, but then again, you have a Martin Kampmann that's coming off a loss, a knockout loss, that being to Johnny Hendricks. So one would say, Martin Kampmann should lose this fight. But again, I'm going on the record saying Martin Kampmann fights never happen like expected. I'm going with upset Martin Kampmann.
It's a great pick. It's a great pick. There's no really wrong pick here in this fight. I love when they have these fights like this. Shogun Sonnen is going to be a pretty good one too, and we'll talk more about that one next week. We don't want to get too ahead of ourselves there, but the Campman Condit fight definitely needs to be highlighted a little bit because it's going to be in between two huge events. The first UFC on Fox Sports 1. So Chris, man, we're probably, I don't know if we're going to have you back for the closing segment, man. I know you're busy down there being a superstar.
Oh, yeah, living it up like a rock star.
All right, guys, we'll be back right after this. We're going to have a guest that Don McGuire recommended to us on the show. They're doing a lot of things with veterans and raising money this weekend, so we're going to get to talk to him in the next segment. We're going to talk to Don McGuire, Dr. Gary Furness again this week. We're all going to gloat about our picks. You guys make sure you go like us on Facebook at MMALockup.com. Make sure you go you follow us on Twitter at MMALockup. Look us up on Google+. We're on Google+, guys. We're on YouTube. You can't search MMA Lockup without finding us. We've made sure of that. So make sure you guys go look us up and follow us, tweet us, do all that crazy stuff on the internet. Chris has been real. We'll come back. He'll be back at the end of the show, guys.
Asking the tough questions of the tough guys. MMA Lockup.
I said we stand a chance against the military tonight. Babylon, Babylon. At my window, all I see is Babylon. All I see is Babylon.